Welcome everyone to a Kepler College community webinar. Today we have Alexander Cummins. He will be presenting Ecology, Propaganda, and Prophecy. Our speaker, Alexander Cummins, he's a historian of early modern magic, astrology, and culture. He has a book out on the 17th century English astrology and magic. He's also written on the cultural history of the apocalypse, which sounds quite fun actually, occult botany, magical herbalism, amulets, planetary sorcery, all kinds of good stuff. And he curates a storehouse of early modern occult texts that have been scanned at the archive. And you can go up to see that. It's at grimoiresontape.tumblr, TUMBLR.com. We're very happy to have him here. And today's presentation on ecology, propaganda, and prophecy is focused on one of the more fun centuries. The 17th century in England was quite a place. Queen Elizabeth dies right at the beginning, and Shakespeare dies pretty early on, but that doesn't stop anything from slowing down. Instead, England gets into a couple of civil wars. You have the Scots and the Irish causing all kinds of trouble. People are either being shipped over to the new colonies or voluntarily escaping to the new colonies. And astrology, magicians, cunning folk, still going strong. Welcome. I'm very glad you are here.
Hello, Enid. Thank you very much for having me. Well, hello, everyone. I'm very pleased to be here. Thank you for that introduction, Enid. I'm going to be talking about the history of this period and astrology of this period. And it's vast. There's much to get through. And so I've broken it down into three kind of topic areas that we can produce some loci about which we can kind of, cohere our information and that kind of thing. So I'll be talking about the environmental applications of astrology in this time, the political, which includes the propaganda, but also things like battlefield reconnaissance, as we'll see, and also the social, which I'm focusing today on medicine and also a certain degree of personal consultation that professional astrologers here will, I'm sure, be somewhat used to. I'd like to say that each of these things could really be their own topic. The scope of meaning that astrology in this period seeks to draw from and interpret is expansive. But for the purposes of this talk, I'm just going to try and get at some of the essential qualities of this kind of history. Now, I understand history is one of those topics that can somehow render the most thrilling, breathtaking, and horrifying events, actions, and affairs into interminably dull endurance tests of patience and sanity sometimes. A bad history teacher can, really turn one off the subject. So bearing this in mind, I'll not be troubling us too much today with dates and kings, but I did think it was worth reminding us of the sequence of some of the events across the 17th century with this timeline. So we have James 6/1, depending on whether you're talking about him being James of Scotland or of England, coming to the throne in 1603, the gunpowder plot, a variety of wars, skirmishes, difficulties. I want to draw attention briefly to the period of 1640 to 1660, where the printing press restrictions are lifted. Previous to that, one would needed to have curried favour at the king's court or from a bishop to publish, to do a big publication of a work. And this lifting of the restrictions produces a period of what's sometimes called the democratization of knowledge, and particularly the democratization of knowledges of things like astrology. And of course we have the English Civil Wars beginning, and yes, plural. We have the trial and execution of a king. We have the Commonwealth, the Protectorate, the Second Commonwealth. All these are referred to in older forms of history as the interregnum, the period between kings, because nothing really happened when England didn't have a king, except that it did. We also have the restoration of the monarchy in 1660, the Great Fire of London, and then the Glorious Revolution, in which one monarch is deposed by another in a relatively bloodless coup. So it's also worth remembering that this century saw plenty of plagues, famines, foreign wars, and of course colonial expansion into this so-called New World. It is, as Enid has already said, an exciting time. And it's an exciting time for astrology. Astrology in early modern England was both widespread and popular. It was well established. Indeed, it's said belief in natural astrology was almost universal in Tudor England. And during the 17th century, I argue its reach and influence extends to unprecedented levels. As William Lilly, early modern England's most eminent astrologer, extolled of the practice, quote, "How many preeminences, privileges, advantages hath God bestowed on thee? Thou rangest above the heavens by contemplation, conceivest the motion and the magnitude of the stars. Thou talkest to angels, yea, with God himself." As you can see, astrology's scope was cosmological, total, and not a little theological. The English took advantage of such access to the wisdom of the stars, both from texts and practitioners. The case notes of astrologer John Booker, for instance, attest to him seeing roughly 1,000 cases a year between 1648 and 1665, while William Lilly's practice processed nearly 2,000 a year at its peak. Nicholas Culpeper, the famous herbalist, who practiced between roughly 1640 and 1654, we are told regularly had 40 or so patients in a morning. There was certainly demand, and astrology seemed to have offered its practitioners a brisk and popular trade. And by the start of the 17th century, there was already a large, though indeterminate number of low-level consultants scattered throughout the country. The combination of extensive publication of astrological handbooks in English, which we'll be looking a little bit at, and the publicity and relative freedom which the astrologers enjoyed must have bolstered these numbers. The historian Owen Davies, adjudicating between reports by the Church of England clergyman Thomas Cooper and more conservative, or perhaps rather less alarmist estimates, gives the number of cunning folk, that is local magical practitioners, village wizards, wise women, commonly employing a variety of astrological techniques. The number of these operating in the country as certainly more than 500 and less than one in every parish. While cunning folk were not all highly trained astrologers and not all astrologers ran local consultation or professional practices, in practice many of these were, it said, indistinguishable from the village wizards. So what kind of sources can we draw on in terms of our secondary source to look at this period? Well, to have a very brief look at the historiography, which is a fancy way of sort of saying the history of the modern history of astrology, if you follow, we can really start with Keith Thomas. I mean, there are previous things. We can talk about Lynn Thorndike if we like, but it's Religion and the Decline of Magic, which burst onto the scene in 1971 and marks a particular movement in the social history of astrology that can be characterized as considerations of the societal impact and importance of this kind of occult philosophy as it's seen, and also magical practice and astrological practice. Chiefly, this consisted of discussing the functions of belief in magic, or astrology in this case, partly drawing on anthropological studies of this kind of thing, partly using people living in traditional or even Aboriginal societies. I'm thinking here particularly of E. Evans Pritchard's 1937 Witchcraft, Oracles and Magic amongst the Azandi, which came out in an abridged version in 1976. A discussion of the decline of both the intellectual value and popularity of European occult philosophy and astrology began to move away from positivist notions of the inherently meritorious rise of modern scientific epistemology and towards consideration of religious and political changes in the 17th century. And it's so then we come to Bernard Camp and his magnificent Astrology in the Popular Press, which offers us brilliant perspectives from an incredibly thorough analysis of 300 years of almanacs. It's an invaluable resource still. If we skip ahead to 1989, we have Patrick Curry's Prophecy and Power. Now, this book is outlining a distinction between elite and democratic astrologies of the time. The former identified by its staunch conservative insistence that inferiors obey superiors, and the latter by its support for free will and responsible action. I mean, this is exemplified by William Lilly's maxim that the stars incline but do not compel. And this book brings social justice to the table, I would argue. It attempts to expressly politicize the eventual decline of astrology, remarking that their use by the popular classes of the late early modern period tails off as the techniques of truth-making become more available to and understood by labouring classes in this period. Anne Geneva, if we have that's bottom second from the left, produced a masterful study in 1995 in the form of Astrology in the 17th Century Mind. The mind in question is William Lilly's, and the book carefully picks through Lilly's unpublished works and early drafts to unlock secrets of his very deliberate political cryptography. chiefly that the House of Midheaven represents the king in civil war conflicts, which we'll come back to. Geneva insists that this is the best and certainly most underappreciated facet of early modern astrology as a means to codify protest and criticism of extant power structures and rulers, hiding them in the plain sight of those with almanacs and the starry eyes to read them. Geneva is also very unhappy with the notion that astrology and magic might in any meaningful way be related, and we do not agree on that. Winding slightly backwards to 1983, I want to briefly enthuse about Michael MacDonald's mystical bedlam, madness, anxiety and healing in 17th century England, which concentrates on the incredibly useful case file records left to us by astrologer-physician Richard Napier, which paint this nuanced and statistically backed picture of early modern magical medical consultation, diagnostics and treatment. And this work is it's simply brilliant. A successor to this work is Lauren Cassell's Medicine and Magic in Elizabethan London, which does a similar job of examining the role of astrology and magic by focusing on a single practitioner, in this case, the days and ways of Dr. Simon Foreman, who was an early modern astrologer, alchemist, magician, and physician, with a somewhat bizarre speciality in both gynecology and, as it turns out, misogyny. Finally, I hope you do not judge me too harshly for including my own modest contribution to this subject, the Starry Rubric, in which I examined the utilities of astrology. There was a tendency in the 70s to try and write studies that explain away why people would believe in astrology or practice astrological magic, and I sought to look at what it actually did. So this talk is in some ways a sort of a condensation of this book. And this is a thumbnail sketch historiography to which I want to draw your attention. There are many other works, but these paint a brief picture of some of the pertinent trends in approaching the history of early modern English astrology. So, what are our primary sources then? Well, I mentioned handbooks, so let's have a look at some of those frontispieces. The 17th century saw an increase in publication of easy-to-use astrological handbooks, most notably, of course, William Lilly's Christian Astrology of 1647. Now, Keith Thomas calls this work simply the most influential vernacular treatise of the 17th century, also reporting claims made, I should note, by rival astrologer John Gabry, that the tome was simply a translation of medieval Arab astrology. The work is therefore remarkable for making traditional astrology accessible rather than marking a significant change in practices, to which the general popularity of Lilly's work attests. Not only was Lilly the most well-known contemporary astrologer, he was quite simply one of the most famous Englishmen. Bernard Capp makes a remark that his face, Lilly's face, circulated annually in thousands of copies for 40 years, was probably the best known of anyone in England after the king. We also have works like Henry Coley's Clavis, which is a slightly more detailed handbook. Again, Coley is a mathematician and it shows. But we also have John Middleton writing nearer towards the end of the century, who dispenses with complicated astronomy and gives a much more straightforward account. But if we're talking about more straightforward accounts, then we need to talk about almanacs. I love almanacs. One of the most popular ways in which 17th century England learned and practiced astrology was through the almanac, those annual calendrical compilations of kitchen physick, agricultural timings, and prognostications for the coming year. Now, Bernard Capp confirms that in the 1660s, for which detailed evidence survives, sales averaged about 400,000 copies annually. And that figure suggests that roughly one family in three bought at least one almanac each year. There was great demand for them and the various kinds of knowledge that they made available. So we see here John Tanner's diary or calendar, which it expressly calls itself. We have also John Booker's The Bloody Almanac, which is a rampant anti-Irish screed, warning of secret papists and so on. And it's an example of the more, we might call, overt propaganda. And then we also have William Lilly's Anglicus Junior, which is more of a commentary on current events and runs more of a kind of commentary propaganda, if you want to see it like that. Now, one of the things I'll be looking at is the use of astrology in Physick, in medicine. And so I want to just briefly look at those. Most famously, we have, of course, Nicholas Culpeper. Astrology played this major role in early modern European medicine, and much information about its practical utility came in the form of instructions in medical diagnostics and treatment. So obviously we have Culpeper and his astrologo-physical discourse, but we also have Sanders and this and other works, such as that of Joseph Blagrave, which we'll be talking about very briefly. which became standards. And we even have this example of John Lamport's method of curing smallpox, which I'll be returning to. In short, astrology plays an important role in an apparently straightforward medical text that has nothing else to do with astrology. We'll come back to Lamport. I'd like to consider that sort of a Chekhov's smallpox cure, if you like. Finally, there are many texts exploring the boundaries and interrelation of natural and occult philosophy that became available at this time, and many of them talk explicitly about astrology. Of course, Giambattista della Porta's Natural Magic is one of the most famous texts on this principle, and it concerns occult forces and properties involved in the mechanics of nature. We also have Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa von Nettesheim's great 3 books of occult philosophy, which has been argued to be simply the greatest encyclopedia of magic in this period, and arguably I would say of any European period. I would dearly love to talk more about Agrippa, but I fear tangents. We're more than happy to talk about that in the questions at the end, and also to remind you that Kepler will indeed be having a talk on Agrippa's astrology itself from Eric Purvey on the 30th of April, as Enid mentioned. Finally, we have works like John Hayden's Holy Guide Leading the Way to Unite Art and Nature. And I have a soft spot for Hayden, who is a keen geomancer as well as an astrologer, and demonstrates again this admixture of doctoring as a medical, philosophical and magical kind of pursuit. Now, if this talk, as I've mentioned a couple of times, as sort of thinking about astrology and its relation to magic of the period, to occult philosophy and magical practice. Again, I don't want to get too much into that at this point, but I will say that arguably one of the most important occult principles to bear in mind when discussing astrology and astrological magic of this period is virtue, occult virtue. This is sometimes thought of as the grace or the potency poured forth from the stars and put to a variety of effects by enterprising astrologers and magicians. Aristotelian scholasticism and more widely Aristotelian metaphysics has an awful lot to say about active and passive principles, that things hold the virtue to affect other things, and those things are affected because they have the virtue to be affected by them. And we're into the realms of non-manifest qualities here. Again, I don't want to go off too far on metaphysics, but this is worth bearing in mind, and it's Agrippa who expressly talks about how the heavens and the stars are these mediators for the emanation of occult virtue from the monistic source of the Creator Almighty. As such, it's probably worth us, if only briefly, mentioning sources on operative magic itself. So chiefly we have the 4th book, which is attributed to Agrippa, but it is almost certainly probably not written by him. And the work I briefly want to mention is the Magical Elements of Peter de Barno, which is also known as the Heptameron, which is a work of astrological angel summoning, based on summoning the 7 archangels of the planets on their respective days of the week. We also have Israel Heibener's work on the secret virtue of sigils, herbs and stones, which he also calls a complete cure and medicine for all diseases of the body as well as mind by outward application only. It's based in, as you can tell, but not exclusively about medical applications, and so it's part herbal, part ephemerides and part amulet construction handbook. Finally, I'd be remiss for not mentioning Reginald Scott's Discovery of Witchcraft, which, as Owen Davies has shown, is actually one of the most popular books for cunning folk and some astrologers to own and use. We have evidence of the amulets constructed from its descriptions of the rites of the supposedly foolish, the gullible and the papist. Scott, as some of you will know, writes the Discovery of Witchcraft as an exhortation against practicing magic or any of these foul unchristian practices. Unfortunately, he details those practices in such elaborate detail that it becomes one of the most popular books for people who want to do those things. Bad news travels fast. So with this in mind about our sources, I'd like to start by discussing the environmental factors. Although astrology was certainly employed in various agricultural endeavours, and we'll talk about some of those, I actually want to start ever so slightly more philosophically. I want to talk about time itself. As Proclus observed, and as Agrippa quoted, time is the number of the motion of the celestial bodies. And early modern astrology offers symbolic meaning for observable phenomena to not only mark but provide meaning for the passage of time. To say, for example, as we know, when the sun enters Aries, as it does at the start of spring to begin the new astrological year, is to say that the fiery nature of Aries acts as an energetic reawakening of nature from its winter slumber to a new spring beginning. A particular period of time and the events occurring within that period were not considered merely arbitrary or coincidental, but closely interlinked. The changing seasonal cycles affected flora, observed in their specific flowering and harvest times. They affected fauna, which is observable in animal mating seasons, and most obviously they affected the seasonal climates. To consider this in a slightly different manner, the effect of winter upon nature, i.e. upon the world and humanity, occurred because such influence was instilled by virtue, of winter's particular astrological identity. As the wild natural world was clearly regulated by specific timings, so too human events and experiences were thought to be linked to time. Astrology offered a cyclical conception of the processes of time upon nature, a nature that united the activities of people and their environment. And so his scope with regards to time was universal. It mapped the entirety of human and cosmic existence, after all. At one end of the scale, we have a concept known as the Great Year, based around astrological precession, which mapped a kind of aeonics of the zodiacal signs and thereby gave a grand cycle of the universe, literally repeating its events and various unfolding history, usually roughly every 36,000 years. On the other end of the spectrum, every hour of human scale time was also attributed its astrological virtues and spirits. Between these two poles of the hour and the whole span of the cosmos, astrology provided structures for the periodization of history, which itself was utilized to predict events and even formulate various apocalypses in stages. I'm happy to talk about millenarianism afterwards if we have any specific questions about that. But for now, I want to get at this idea of nested cycles by talking about periodization. So, astrological periodization offers an understanding of early modern conceptions of what Cap calls an overall framework of history. Royalist astrologer George Wharton considered 500 to 700 year periods as important historical epochs. He explains that history is made of sundry changes and translations of kingdoms, whilst these or these planets reign and bear rule with others. Specifically, he appealed to astrological effect on the human biology of successive generations. Wharton claimed that empires generally existed for this 500 to 700 year period because successive generations of humans became, as he put it, weaker than their forefathers, culminating in a sixth generation. As the planets cycled around and humans became weaker until their next astral infusion of vitality, so too our empires waned and collapsed, or else were overthrown by a newly invigorated generation. And so we can sort of see that history for Wharton is made by people, but those people are shaped by the heavens. What's also interesting about astrological periodization is that it uses analysis to form epochs or structural mechanic models of how events play out, not just in the past, but in the future. It converts the knowledge of history into the actions of projection and prediction. Now, on the one hand, my supervisor and now colleague, Professor Hutton, is very eager to point out that historians have an incredibly bad track record at predicting events based off history. Nevertheless, I think it's fair to say that prediction, I think we can agree, is a useful thing. Forewarned is forearmed, and astrology was used to predict natural disasters, epidemics of plague, of which the 17th century had several, as we've already noted, and various millenarian apocalypses. I'd love to go into each of those, but we must content ourselves today by focusing, I'd like to focus on agriculture. Because humans need food, food is important, and besides, knowledge divorced from the land seems to have landed us in hot water at this point in capitalist post-modernity, although that too is perhaps a talk for another time. So let's talk about meteorology. Astrology was considered crucial for analysing climate. Weather forecasts had an important place in 17th century almanacs. Indeed, an almanac without weather predictions was considered by one contemporary reporter to be like a pudding without suet or a Christmas pie without plums, clearly unthinkable. It was clearly a staple part of what readers wanted or expected, and meteorology was a common interest for astrologers. By understanding climate, one could take advantage of this knowledge, most obviously in agriculture. Almanacs frequently offered advice on the agriculturally propitious times to plough, sow, geld animals, and fell timber. Such agricultural utilities were a simpler version than formal figure casting, often involving a lot less maths. Astrologer and mathematician Henry Coley suggested, in fact, that all agricultural astrology really needed was the zodiacal sign that the sun occupied and the phases of the moon. Moon law, as a particular subset of what we might call folk astrology, offered optimum times for when land should be manured and, again, when to geld lambs. Cap has gathered several examples of the use of astrological principles in gardening, farming and planting, and even one from diarist John Evelyn, who was a rabid critic of judicial astrology especially, and he observed the correct moment to plant trees. Now, this shouldn't really surprise us, given that plants responding to annual temperature, moisture fluctuations, and arguably the occult astral influences do genuinely germinate better when particular planting times are observed. And here we see how early modern astrology offered a certain further depth of analysis of such natural phenomena. Now, of course, to talk about proper planting times, we're really talking about elections. The Latin phrase that dear Elias Ashmole uses at the end here is probably meant to be, every man, is the architect of his own fortune. This is attributed to the Roman patrician Appius Claudius Caecus. So, while agricultural election relied more on general knowledge of favourable periods than exact figures or charts, the principles are very, very similar. In searching for the most appropriate point in time to begin an endeavour, in order to take full advantage of the various astrological influences, most agricultural astrology, I would argue, is a form of election. So, agricultural astrology further affirms the advantage of humanity acting as part of their natural environment, in harmony with these annual rhythms of nature. Such affirmation attempts not only to explain the forces influencing the links between people and their landscape, or their crops, or their animals, but explores the best method and practice for fully taking advantage of these forces. Now, this wasn't simply limited to choosing times to plant. Elections could also to know particular points to attempt to capture these kinds of astral influences. And we're actually, when we get down to that kind of thing, talking about amulet craft to a certain extent. And so I want to talk briefly about mansion images. The power of the moon, as we've sort of mentioned in agricultural astrology, should be considered in terms of, partly at least, in terms of the magical images of its mansions, which, as I'm sure many of you know, are particular celestial positions, similar in some ways but very different in other ways to the houses of the heavens. The moon could operate as a charge for magical talismans to aid farming, as well as a clock by which to tell planting times. Now, Agrippa lists images of the 24th and the 25th mansions as being used respectively for the multiplying of herds of cattle and for the preservation of trees and harvests. Now, Giambattista della Porta has an interesting thing to say about the use of natural magic to gather and store seasonal astral influences, and it's been remarked by both early moderns and some contemporary practitioners that there's a certain similarity in terms of casting amulets or sigils, which astrological sigils should be distinguished from later Austin Spare and chaos magic sigils. These are specific astrological glyphs. But there's a certain similarity between casting sigils or other kinds of amulets and making jam. One prepares a suitable sterile vessel, one collects the fruit of the stars, one does certain preparations to preserve it, and then hopefully, if all goes well in your ritual, you have access to those fruits of the stars out of season, so to speak. Now, one of the main ways in which these kind of amulets could be constructed was through the utility and observation of planetary hours, sometimes called artificial hours, confusingly, because that also refers to a whole different kind of timing. But here's a quote from John Hayden, again, the Rosicrucian astromagus, geomancer and astrologer. He says, about the times of choosing the planetary hours, for almost all astrologers divide that space of time between the sun rising to setting into 12 equal parts and call them the 12 hours of the day, and then distribute each of those hours to every one of the planets according to the order of successions. Now, the order in which he refers to is, of course, the Chaldean order, which goes from heaviest to lightest planet, or slowest to most alacritus, Saturn to Mercury. Now, Astrology characterized each hour as carrying an inherent significance, as I've already said, and this is one of the ways it did so. It provided an astrological undercurrent of meaning for each mundane utility of daily timing. And it should be noted, if we're not aware of these, that planetary hours are not based upon the position of the stars at that time of day, but on a symbolic astrological sequence. And we can therefore note a kind of separation, an early modern separation between the symbolism of astrology and the observations of astronomy. Now that's a complicated area in terms of the epistemology, I realise, but this is a useful distinction for the time being, at least the scaffolding that we can build our understanding of and then take off and look at the thing itself. We can note here also a separation, and these hours could be employed to soak appropriate kinds of astral virtues, either to utilise in ritual or to construct talismanic magical objects, and therefore they're vital in one of the utilities of magical timing. So all this is getting towards a notion of natural magic, or if you prefer, magical nature. For astrologers, as Patrick Curry has put it, nature was infused with divinity, spirituality, and magicality. Astrology operated in a natural and magical world. We have this kind of habit in modern parlance of talking about things as if by magic, as if magic is the anomalous, the freakish, that which goes beyond the realm of physics. That's a very different notion of magic from the Renaissance and from early modern England, certainly, where nature was magical. And we can see this in an example from Porter explaining the natural basis of this magic with particular reference to the advantages to be gained from studying the stars. And here he says, I think that magic is nothing else but the survey of the whole course of nature. For whilst we consider the heavens, the stars, the elements, how they are moved and how they are changed, by this means we find out the hidden secrecies of living creatures, of plants, of metals, and of their generation and corruption. It is these hidden secrecies we should bear in mind when considering early modern occult philosophy. The occluded element of magical practice seems less about veiled elite knowledge than simply the pursuit of the hidden inner workings of life. Bearing in mind that metals were commonly regarded as organic and thought to grow in the veins of the earth, Porter's wider point becomes clear. Each of these forms of life, animals, plants, metals, existed and functioned literally by virtue of their hidden secrecies. Such study of the occult virtues of things, quote, openeth unto us the properties and qualities of hidden things and the knowledge of the whole course of nature. So astrology, we can see, considered events of the human microcosmic world a part of the natural macrocosmic world. And therefore astrology concerned itself with mass movements in human society, assessing them as natural expressions of natural forces and processes. So if we take an example, Francis Bacon defined his naturalistic astrologia sana, his sane astrology, for example, to be concerned with all commotions or great innovations of things natural and civil. And we hear of this, this litany of things that he specified. His new astrology, his streamlined astrology, would study comets, meteors, inundations, droughts, heats, frosts, earthquakes, fiery eruptions, winds, great rains, the seasons of the year, plagues, epidemic diseases, plenty, famine, wars, seditions, sects, and the transmigrations of people. In other words, much of the directions and effects of politics itself could be considered environmental. And such a sociological position was not lost on early modern astrologers and magicians. And this is my kind of segue into talking about politics. So if it hasn't been stressed enough so far, let me reiterate. Early modern astrology extended analysis into all areas of life, all events, tendencies, and eventualities. Now, the historian Anne Geneva makes a striking analogy, and it's one that I absolutely love. If you can forgive her being rather firm or critical of early modern astrologers. She says, like economists, astrologers rarely made correct predictions, yet universities granted degrees in the subject, and few heads of state made a move without them. I really like this comparison. It's in this prestigious economist-like role that astrologers fulfilled both judicial and horary astrology, as we're aware, of making particular speculations and predictions about human events, either on a broad national political scale or a more detailed level of personal and individual problems or concerns. So, What kind of analysis were they doing? Well, astrologers would cast an annual speculative figure for the world itself, a Figura Mundi, a form of astrological annual revolution. As you can see, these use some of the period's standard house correspondences. We can also note, this is from one of Lilly's works, and we can also note here that, as I mentioned earlier, the 10th house is not merely meant to denote the king, but specifically Charles, and this is very important, both Charleses, in fact, and this is very important for unfolding events in the Civil War. And Geneva also gives us an excellent description of the activity of setting a Figura Mundi. She describes it as these political astrologers computing the world's yearly birthday, and this figure would be used by astrologers to make predictions about the fate of the entire society, its rulers, ruling classes, harvests, plagues, famine, weather. This should look quite familiar to us by now, as well as the people, anything likely to affect the society as a whole. What's a practical example of this kind of politics from environment? Well, let's look, say, at Lilly's Revolution for 1644. It was this figure that almanac writing astrologers, or this kind of figure I should say, that almanac writing astrologers made most use of to draw up their national and international appraisals and prognostications. So Lilly based his here from Molinus Anglicus Jr. of 1644 on such a figure of the heavens at the time, this ingress of the sun into the first point of Aries. It actually might not be. The details of this chart become very unclear as to exactly what point he's picking, and I don't want to go into specific techniques at this point. I kind of want to show you what he's doing with it more, and we can then decide how much he's kind of fudging his processes. For instance, in this figure, Mercury, described as the father of lies and untruths, is to be found in Pisces, a common sign, supposedly, which tells us that it will all this whole year vex us with flying reports, continual fears, false alarms, untoward speech, contradictory news, lying messengers, and cousining accompetants, receivers, treasurers, and the like. And so we can see here in Lilly's assessment of this chart the overt but non-specific political implications of this statement and how they highlight the status of astrologers as political surveyors. You know, they announced the total character of the year's political affairs. I've also asked a friend and colleague, Wade Caves, who has a particular interest in William Lilly, having just edited a 300-year anniversary edition of William Lilly's Life and Times, which I can thoroughly recommend getting hold of, to have a look at this chart and pull out a couple of things. The fixed sign rising means it's meant to last all year. Mars is the Lord of the year, again associated with this period of conflict, obviously. The moon's next aspect is to Venus, ruler of the 12th house, and we might say that, you know, this is interesting in light of Cromwell winning a decisive victory in the English Civil War during this period, leading to a chain of events that formed the New Model Army, the imprisonment of King Charles II. Lilly also assesses the previous and future lunations, including eclipses, in reference to this Figura Mundi. Crucially, interpretation of the Figura Mundi demonstrates again how astrology created meaning by exploring natural interrelations of human political phenomena and the environment and resolving a continuum of time in general with particular instances and events. So what of the horary stuff? Well, this practice is explained and understood in this period on the basis of this quote from John Gadbury, which gives a good assessment of the kind of worldview. And I really like it. I like this idea of the time of the birth of the mind. I think this introduces an idea about the affective quality of knowledge itself, affective as well as effective. The querent themselves was responsible for the timing of the questioning to a degree, which through horary ritual would provide a snapshot of the astrological forces currently at work. And the astrological action revealed knowledge and an understanding of the situation in question that could facilitate further and better action. And this is a concept I'm going to kind of ruminate around through the course of this talk. Specific examples of horary stuff. We know that astrology was being used for kings and the affairs of kings. So Elias Ashmole, for whom we have to thank for the Ashmolean Museums, but makes note of figures he cast which often related to political concerns. A figure cast on the 20th of January of 1648 asks, for instance, whether the king shall be restored and whether his life be not in danger. Ashmole also kept a close watch on the movements of the planets to deduce general political mood and direction. Between the 7th and the 31st of January of 1674, for instance, he wrote notes on events in Parliament, accompanied by references to current astrological constellations. And we have the work of historian C.H. Joston to thank for having gone through many of Ashmole's diaries, some of which were in a cipher and a unique kind of shorthand for many of these notes. They also detail Ashmole's proclivities towards casting sigils and a certain degree of his what looked like self-administered marriage counselling for the turbulent time he had between himself and his wife. I'm happy to talk about that at the end as well. Moreover, though, Ashmole seems even to have asked for astrological counsel, to have been asked, sorry, I should say, for astrological counsel by King Charles II himself, who asked Ashmole to calculate and to interpret a horoscope for the time at which he began his speech at the opening of Parliament on the 27th of October, 1673. Now, at this point, I also want to point out that horary astrology, indeed all forms of astrology, were not simply the preserve of aristocrats and gentry. They were also for a variety of labouring and working class peoples and for radicals. Sadly, we don't have as many portraits of levellers, diggers, ranters, and so forth. The vast explosion of religious radicals and sectarians in this period. So we're content with this woodcut. Keith Thomas judges that there was well-documented recourse to astrologers by radicals of all kind. Thus, we have the case of Lilly's horary work for prominent leveller leader Richard Overton, answering whether, by joining with the agents of the private soldiery of the army for the redemption of common right and freedom to the land, and removal of oppressions from the people, my endeavours shall be prosperous or no. Thomas points out that Overton was hardly thought a superstitious man, and the scare quotes are heavily quoted there. Indeed, he quotes P. Zagorin's assessment that the radical leader was a firm rationalist who rejected dogmatic, unquestioning belief. Overton's note of April 1648, asking for Lilly's expert astrological opinion, therefore cannot be regarded simply as the actions of a simple, gullible, or backwards man. And I realise I'm preaching to the choir here, but rather, we can definitely see a rational decision maker taking full advantage of every means at his disposal to investigate and analyse a complex and shifting political situation. So speaking of complex and shifting political situations, to discuss the actual stirring of those shifts, we need to talk about propaganda. And to do this, I want to talk about horary figures again, really. They could be considered ample opportunity for propaganda. So when interpreting a horary figure set for the time of His Majesty's present march, begun from Oxford on the 7th of May, 1645, George Wharton, the royalist, emphasises, amongst other things, the regal sign Leo is in the first house and that the Sun, Venus and Jupiter are in fortuitous positions. He insists that these are evident and undeniable testimonies of the king's success. In contrast, eventual parliamentarian Lilly claimed that the position of Mercury, which he says was simply the most strong in this present figure, and a fact that George Wharton is said to have affirmed in his own words at this time, meant that the victory assured in the figure would go to that which was signified by a sign ruled by Mercury. In this case, Lilly says, Gemini is the ascendant of the city of London, all authors agree, and seeing as Mercury was lord of that sign, Lilly interpreted the figure to mean that the city and citizens of London would be victorious by being the kingdom's bulwark against tyranny and oppression. He furthermore added that this city shall get into their power all their enemies, for we see Mercury disposeth of Jupiter. Such examples reflect the remarkable flexibility, quote, of astrology as an interpretive language system. They also further emphasize the interpreter role of astrologers, especially those making expressly political judgments. So another kind of astrological political speculation / propaganda was the study of rulers' nativities. Now, this was somewhat of a risky business. Laws prohibited the calculation or consideration of such genitures of rulers who were still alive, and several practitioners were imprisoned for just this. The illegality of such activity itself provides us with an idea of how powerful such a practice was considered. Calculating a regent's life expectancy was, in popular estimation, quote, not far removed from the malevolent conjuration to take away the ruler's life. Moreover, as we know, the nativity figure does hold enciphered symbols that can be related to the native's time and manner of death. So Lilly describes the 8th house's nature and signification as death, its qualities and nature, what kind of death a man shall die. And it's both politically savvy and kind of polite as a result to wait until a ruler died before you publish their nativity. So Gadbury's Nativity of the late King Charles was subtitled tellingly, A Brief History of Our Late and Unhappy Wars. Astrology once more united the individual and the events surrounding them. It described history as the actions of people, analysed by mapping influences of divine forces. Astrological interpretations were used to spin nativities to particular assessments of the ruler's character, as we can see here. So it is that we have a monarchist arguing for the great, sanguine, choleric nature of this ruler, and we have Lilly arguing for some of the rather more negative features of a Leo. So the personality of the monarch was explained, or one might say emphases were reprioritized in nativity analysis for expressly political reasons. Reasonably enough, the personalities of rulers, particularly the powerful ones of pre-modern times, were still held to be an important part of political analysis. As Thomas says, in an age of near absolute monarchy, the attention paid to the horoscopes of royal princes was fully justified. The political history of a nation could, to some extent, be explained in terms of the individual psychology of its rulers. Now, these astrological assessments of the personalities, proclivities, foibles, and idiosyncrasies of political leaders were not simply ad hominem attacks, although certainly this was also popular. When speaking of powerful autocrats, we should remember the personal was certainly the political. We should also note that the Gadbury's interpretation offers this very humoral perspective, and that's something we'll return to when we look at medicine and also personal consultancy. So the sheer utility and power of astrology meant that during the Civil War, royalists and parliamentarians alike exploited the propaganda value of astrological predictions. In order to repudiate negative judgments, it became necessary, if you like, to use an astrologer to catch an astrologer. And historian Harry Rush conjures a wonderful image of an astrological dimension to the Civil War that I really like. He says, while the armies of King Charles and Parliament fought in the fields, the astrologers chose to defend their causes with their almanacs in the personal and vitriolic battle of words. And this battle of words between astrologers was not restricted to interpretation, but also to critical analysis of the work and technical skill of other astrologers. So we have here George Wharton, who criticizes William Lilly and fellow Roundhead astrologer John Booker, saying, "Art not you, Booker, and Mr. Lilly alike ashamed to account yourselves master in astrology, when neither of you have yet attained so much skill as to set a figure of heaven exactly?" Much of this shade or conflict was made up of slander and personal attacks. For example, the satirical altering of Wharton's super subtle anagrammatic pen name Narworth to No-worth is a clearly very sophisticated shade being thrown. But we should note that such attacks were more than simply childish squabbling. Upon the battlefield of rival almanacs, the political had become the personal, and to attack the man was to attack his ability to defend his political position. So what can we say about the astrological politics of the time, or the political astrology of the time? Well, we have a link between God's will and man's action. Astrology's political implications and applications highlight the importance of the astrologer's role in interpreting of the divine ordering. Their interpretations were politically very useful. Astrologers offered assurances of victory, justifications of political action, political assessments of recent events, and counter-analysis and refutations against the astrological propaganda efforts of one's enemies. I have a particular example of this that I won't go into now, but I'm happy to at the end, where there was a speech in Parliament given during the Restoration, which basically blames the entire interregnum on a period of bad stars. And this does some very interesting things in terms of attempting to both put it behind Parliament and also to offer this kind of ultimatum of, if you continue being a rebel, then we'll deal with you very harshly. And I'm happy to talk about that. That's a speech related to probable speechwriter Edward Hyde. Astrologers offered these assurances of victory, of course, and this activity was backed up by interpretations of divine favour from whichever side that particular astrologer backed. And so Lilly is apparently very unself-conscious in announcing in the postscript to the Starry Messenger that God is on our side. The constellation of heaven, after a while, will totally appear for the Parliament. Astrological knowledge of divine underlying forces informed and justified politics. It thereby linked not only politics and religion, but also humanity with its environment. Our political ordering and activity might have been thought of, and I think was thought of, as a rung on a ladder bridging the individual and the entire universe, happening with rather than merely around us. Astrology analysed these shifting foundations of politics. It offered insider information on the way political events were developing. It interpreted the continuum of political contexts as a multitudinous series of nested cycles, constantly beginning and ending. Beginnings gave us new opportunities to examine the astrological factors surrounding political events through horary consultation and election. Endings of old influences stressed a new sense of responsibility and themselves gave way to new beginnings, for astrology has no place for a vacuum. Political horary astrology used knowledge to affect situations through interpretation and analysis. The political activities of astrologers during the civil wars highlight how tangible action was just as much a part of being an astrologer as predicting and printing. And the recourse to astrological investigation and analysis itself was also another act requiring a certain inherently magical idea about the generation of knowledge through understanding occult virtues in time, and even of underlying interrogation of fate and destiny. The ritual of horary astrology invested themselves directly in the process of divination, this collaboration between client and practitioner. The time they put their question to the astrologer was the quote-unquote random input element necessary for divinatory knowledge generation. Those were heavy scare quotes again. This very process highlighted deeply occult principles underlying early modern astrological practice. Everything was connected, reflected, and reflecting. There was in fact no randomness when it came to destiny, merely the time ordained to act, to inquire, and to decide, encoded within which was an understanding waiting to be unfolded. Knowledge itself at this point becomes an action of comprehension, analysis, and interpretation. Determining a correct time, as in election, and deciphering such a time's meaning in horary work were intensely political acts. So we come to the social. And I want to start off by talking about health and medicine, and then moving into more personal consultancy stuff around things that start to look like psychiatry and psychology. And those two words are themselves both 15th century French terms, so they're not anachronistic to use in this kind of time. But I'm wary of a certain psychologizing of the magic. Again, I'm happy to go into that at the end. Astrology was, as I have stressed already, of central importance to early modern medicine. It was used as a diagnostic tool by clergymen, licensed physicians, and the myriad irregulars who also practiced physic. Astrological medicine concerned itself with understanding the nature of illness by studying how particular influences of the stars affected the patient. The most common astrological diagnostic techniques were either horary figures based on the time of consultation between patient and practitioner, or a decumbiture, as we'll probably know, a horary figure set at the time the patient became ill. Now, not many people had clocks at this point, and so most astrology physicians were using horary figures of when the patient came to ask them about their illness. Alternatively, a patient's nativity chart could be studied to discover the illnesses and imbalances against which they had a natural weakness, or indeed proclivities in their humoral composition or constitution, or temperament, as it was known, being a term referring to the tempering or the alloying of the mix of these humours. Now, these medical charts of decipherable astrological symbolism were the early modern equivalent, as has been compared by other historians, of blood tests and other modern diagnostic technologies. A planet's position could be examined to yield information about the problem. So it's said that Mars in Leo affects the heart and the diseases of fever, and the cause of it choler, i.e. the yellow bile, the fiery humour that clearly has an influence from both Mars and Leo. Lilly's Christian Astrology Handbook also teaches how to analyse nativities for inherent susceptibilities to certain conditions or illnesses, further highlighting ways astrology explored and utilised the links between one's situation and oneself. So one can't really go in too much detail to humoral theory itself, but it is essential to understand. And so we have this, again, I hope I'm not teaching any grandmothers to suck eggs here, but humoral theory is very important for us to look at. It's the dominant medical model for at least 1500 years in Europe, and it posits a couple of really useful things, that there are underlying cosmic building blocks of the elements, that there are probably 4 of these, that they have corollaries in the human body in the form of these moistures or humours, and that crucially good health is the product of a eucratic or a good mixture of these humours, and the humours themselves are corollaries of the manifest qualities of certain things. Now, again, I'm happy to go into the Aristotelian metaphysics of this if we want, but those manifest qualities of dry, hot, cold, and moist can be combined to create the elements, but also ensure both that one element can turn into another, that we can boil water and it will turn into steam, but also that everything in the universe, which after all is made of the commixture of these elements, isn't constantly blurring together into a kind of beige mess. This is expressly important in astrological terms for the elemental triplicities. So, as we'll see, when a chart demonstrated that one might have an excess of, say, the black bile and was thus experiencing melancholia, one could either attempt to avoid this through phlebotomy. After all, the blood was considered to carry all of these humours and should be distinguished from the sanguine humour, which we might think of as more like the plasma of blood for a modern analogy. So one could either void the black bile to again achieve equilibrium, or one could add more of the sanguine humour. One might receive a blood transfusion, which were uncommon but not massively uncommon. I could talk a lot more about humoral theory, but I'm hoping that gives us a good basis of why we're talking about this at all. Now, of course, the humours and the elements also had a certain explanation and analysis in the planets. And this is it's not the only or exclusive, but it is one account of how the humours and the planets relate. And I like it because it gives us a notion of both the ennobled humours of the Sun and Venus, respectively, and also their ignoble or destructive qualities in Mars and the Moon. It also here presents Mercury as unstable, and which is an interesting term for it, that it's good with the good and bad with the bad, as we're familiar. Finally, astrology and astrological medicine had plenty to say about Melothesia, which as a term might not be relatively familiar, but as a concept I'm sure is. And this is the attribution of various parts of the body to rulership by the zodiacal signs. And one of the things that this did was allow for underlying causes to be located and treated, as well as simply symptoms. One could go to an astrologer physician with a stomachache and be told that, if Aries was prominent in the chart's description of the nature of the illness, that the actual cause of this was something in the head, and that this was causing humours to drain into the stomach. And this is interesting again in terms of symptoms versus causes, and also how a diagnosis of the astrological character or nature of a disease or a dyscrasia, an imbalance, could itself be rectified. And that's something I'm going to return to briefly. And one of the things about studying medical astrology of this period is that we're very lucky, because astrologer physicians were some of the first to keep detailed case files. Previous to them, most people weren't really particularly interested in that. Why would I need to tell you about when I'd been ill before? I'm coming to talk to you about when I'm ill now. And astrologers were some of the first to keep detailed case notes and to compare, recent decumbatures to previous decumbatures or other charts for the same client. It's also interesting that astrologers were sharing these case files with each other and attempting to learn more about their craft. In terms of the philosophy of astrology, it's sometimes posited that it wasn't a proper craft or science because it thought it understood everything and wasn't trying to. There were no more problems to fix, as I'm sure many of us know. There are plenty of areas where further analysis and collation of results and information render new and fresh and concise and innovative astrological solutions and methodologies. And this is, you know, exactly what early modern astrologers were doing as well. So we have here the case file of Thomas Goodman, and we see here that you know, he's come with a pain to the left side of the neck and in his stomach and chest. One of the unfortunate things about the case notes is that they didn't seem terribly good at noting their prescriptions, what their prognoses, which we occasionally get, or indeed what treatments they offered for these things. But we do have the chart itself. So speaking of treatments, what kind of things were used? Well, once an astrological medical diagnosis had been made, a cure could be prescribed through either various purges or planetary governorships. And it said you may strengthen the part of the body by its like, as the brain by herbs of Mercury, and in addition you may oppose diseases by herbs of the planet opposite to the planet that causeth them, as diseases of Mars by herbs of Venus, and the contrary. Now again, I hope I'm not you know, speaking down to any medical astrologers here. The occult virtues afforded to natural resources by astrological governances, though, could be used to rebalance a patient's temperament. By knowing the astrological signifier of either the disease or the part of the body affected, one could automatically construct a treatment to counteract this influence, simply by understanding the sympathies and antipathies of the elements, planets, and signs. So astrological understanding of flora and fauna also allowed astrological medical practitioners to have easy access to a form of what we might think of as natural talismanic magic, whereby the planetary influence of certain herbs could be used to affect patients needing equilibrium to be re-established. So it is that astrologer, physician, and cunning man Joseph Blagrave utilized the talismanic nature of some herbal remedies, prescribing his patients to wear a select number of herbs gathered at astrologically appropriate times. And he would generally get them to wear these around the neck in a little bag. These were practical benefits of the astrological exploration of the essential natural magical identity and properties of the environment. It was a living system employing a unifying universal scope of meaning to select natural resources to steer the course of the sickness towards recovery. That is, to effect practical results through an application of knowledge, understanding, and informed action. Now, the use of sprigs of herbs as you know, external use as well as internal wasn't the limit of medical amulets. In fact, there are a number of them. So I have here just one example from a Paracelsian treatise. It's on, as you can see, the sigil of Cancer. Artificial talismans such as these astrological sigils, seals, and images were also used in medical treatment. Talismans could draw forth elemental forces to return equilibrium to imbalanced humours. So precisely because elemental fire are considered to have opposite manifest qualities, hot and dry and cold and moist respectively, Agrippa describes how images of Cancer, Scorpio and Pisces, because they do constitute the watery triplicity, do prevail against hot and dry fevers. The scope of potential talismanic treatments were not limited to humoral readjustment. Planetary and zodiacal symbolism was also utilized. I'm happy to talk about that as well, but we have examples of, say, an image of Scorpio, which is a kind of brass or gold arthropod of some kind, a sort of giant kind of lobster thing, would be hung on the bed posts of someone who was said to have been suffering from diseases caused by the bites of insects, for instance. I'm happy to go on that again. But I do want to return, because I promised I would, to Lamport and his smallpox purges, which is either the best or the worst band name I've come across recently, probably both. So even treatments not themselves, especially astrological, were carefully timed by election. Indeed, it said virtually all physicians of the period employed astrology in their practice to determine appropriate days for bloodletting and purging, and to set a schedule for administering medications. So in Lamport's small treatise, which details a cure for smallpox, which doesn't apply any explicit astrological dimension to it really, the author adds an appendix on the basis that after the work had been submitted in order to be printed, quote, "It came into my mind that I had given directions to vomit such persons as should be infected with the smallpox as a purge, but had given no instruction to the ignorant tenders how to govern the patient during the time that it is working, and that therefore I will first show to such as have little insight into astrology how to elect a proper time for the administration of the medicine." So established was such a practice, even in 1685, that the author Lamport added a whole appendix dedicated to including this vital astrological feature of treatment. This is the perceived power of the natural magic of an astrological universe. Bad timing might literally kill you. This kind of medical election presented the treatment in a universal context and made both practitioner and patient uniquely aware of the environmental factors influencing their activity. Not only the disease and diagnosis, but the cure itself became part of an unfolding destiny, interconnected through applied analysis of specific points in time and empowered by the influences of the stars. Using election, the medical astrologer could thus manipulate the forces of nature to heal his patients, or hers. We come then to personal consultancy. So various astrological magical practitioners offered knowledge and practice of what Martin Ingram characterizes as a rich variety of magical practices to deal with everyday frustrations, longings, and dilemmas. Much of an astrological practitioner's workload came in the form of providing information and understanding. The most common question put to an astrological practitioner was, quid agendum, what's to be done? Astrology's universal comprehensiveness allowed it to answer questions concerning anything. Offered the chance to know about anything, most early modern people were interested in their relationships. Love consults were not limited to forecasts of spouse material, though these were common. They included relationship advice and marriage counselling. As professional astrologers amongst us will know, this should hardly be surprising. This could even be extended to magical action. So cunning-folk were sometimes offered to make ill husbands to be good to their wives through a variety of astrological magical techniques. Astrology considered the love lives and kinships of individuals as part of the overall pattern of the universe. Likewise, complicated family matters could be consoled and explained. Indeed, every kind of domestic entanglement was ventilated in the astrologer's consulting room, it has been said. In particular, astrology provided the paternity tests of its day for uncertain men and women, and I think this demonstrates a certain performativity of astrological announcements about personal identity. I mean, in an era of aristocratic bloodlines, astrological knowledge about your parentage could literally change your life. Now, I do want to just concentrate briefly on one such personal consultation. I feel, writing in the 70s, that Sir Keith Thomas is a little dismissive when he talks about this incessant stream of servant girls. And so I wanted to offer another example. It's an example I like for a couple of reasons. It's one of the love life of one Eusebius Andrews, who is a client of Dr. Simon Forman. And it offers an instance of many interesting things, how astrology was related to another divination practice of geomancy, how one switched between them, and also some of the common frustrations that professional consulting astrologers faced from their rather more eager, shall we say, clients. So we know from the case notes of Simon Forman that on Saturday, the 11th of April, 1601, at 3 p.m., Dr. Simon Forman cast a geomantic figure for Eusebius Andrews about his future romantic relations with Mary Curson, for he first spake to her and kissed her at 8 p.m. the previous evening. This encounter had, it seems, been a little way coming. Andrews was a repeat customer, having consulted Forman specifically about marriage prospects 4 times previously. The first over a marriage to a Lettice Rotherham, which is another of my favourite names from this period. 2 days later, he asks about a pairing with a Dorothy Walsingham, and then nearly a month later asks twice in as many days about Mary Curson. Now, Andrews had initially consulted with Forman at 8:30 in the morning on Monday, the 30th of March, 1601, and he came back the following day at 10 a.m. to ask again. As professional astrologers, again, might be familiar with this kind of client. And really, this is one of the reasons I'm interested in history, and particularly the history of emotion and its relation to magic and astrology, how we can get at the beating heart of the personal and the quotidian in observing and attempting to analyze the days and ways of our ancestors. We don't know what Forman's considered prognosis of this was, but we do know on both of these occasions he was asked if conditions were right to ask Curson to marry. Significantly, we also know he cast an astrological chart on the Monday and a geomantic chart on the Tuesday. Forman had used astrology to assess the Andrews-Rotherham pairing and a combination of astrology and geomancy for that of Walsingham. Now, Lauren Cassell judges that for Forman, alchemy and magic, along with astrology and geomancy, were kindred arts. Such observation about the interrelation of apparently separate disciplines, activities, or types of divination as considered part of the same approach or practice does not seem anomalous. So one of the most famous writers on geomancy in this time, the English translation of Christopher Catan's geomancy, notes in the opening of his handbook that it is easy to know that geomancy is none other thing but astrology, and a third mean, that is to say, participating of the two, which is alchemy. Now, I don't want to get too much into considerations of, categorizations or departments of astrology and alchemy. I just want to say that Forman considered astronomy, astrology, astromagic, geomancy, and alchemy as essential practices that both relied upon and informed the practices of each of the others. Now, it's possible that Andrews had asked for one or other form of the divination specifically on the 11th of April, or perhaps Forman was simply growing tired of Andrews' increasingly frequent visits and decided on a more direct and unambiguous geomantic reading, which, as anyone who does geomancy can note, it is occasionally very blunt, along with being, if you forgive the double pun, both gnomic and down to earth. It also seems significant that the last consultation on Saturday, the 11th of April, abandoned talk of marriage and merely asked, quid inde sequitur? What will happen next? Now, I'm happy to talk about relations between astrology and geomancy, I should note. I hope that wasn't too much of a tangent from our topic. We can say that astrology was a vital interpretive craft for analysis of fate. It relied on a magical cosmos capable of revealing details of one's answer from a snapshot of stars taken at the point of asking your question. Horary work, along arguably with election, relied on a living universe, and this organic universe is an expressly natural, magical one, at least in the early modern world. As has been observed in the post-Restoration world, seen through the window of contemporary astrology, a line was drawn not between magic and reason, as is so often assumed, but through magic, dividing it into acceptable and unacceptable sorts. In addressing such principles as contagion or sympathy, we find the foundations and many practices of astrology that at this time were deeply magical. In the motions of the stars, the universe narrated its story, relating itself to itself in this kind of ongoing interrelation. It is this active engagement with a magical universe, of being part of the expressions of the cosmos, that made astrology a spiritual as well as a practical craft. It united the individual with existence, for want of a better term, finding a role for one as an active participant in this natural magical universe. This is the context of the manner in which 17th century English astrology operated as a practical Christian theology, as a parallel to the church rather than competitor. Astrologers' practices were certainly different, but it's been noted that their roles as intermediaries, interpreters, and even liminaries between the divine and the everyday were not. So, social astrology illustrates the most personally affecting connections of this grand unifying spectrum, those between individual, group, society, and environment. It placed the ailments of particular parts of the human body within the same context as analysis of the body politic, and traced both of these back to fundamental principles of celestial influence. The combination of astrology and humoral theory also identified and analyzed influences we would nowadays consider of a biological as well as psychological nature, likewise within the same fundamental framework. Analysis of both body and mind, not to mention soul, were constructed from the same modeling of a multiplicity of forces and contexts. Now, one of the useful ways we might consider this is that this is pre-Cartesian. This is pre that dualism. This is pre that divide between mind and body. Before what historian Bruce Green describes as how Descartes convinced certain European intellectuals, and some to this day, that they could think without their bodies. Likewise, talk of humoral theory in its relation to the passions and to proclivities and experience and expression of our emotional lives and interrelations with others was an ensouled phenomena. It relied upon the motions of the sensitive faculties of the soul. And I'm more than happy to talk more about this, but I just wanted to talk, just to address briefly a sense of that multiplicity of forces and contexts. As you might have noticed, I've talked about a couple of things here. The themes that we've had running through have been the interrelation of certain magical premises about the operation and organization of the cosmos and astrology. I've also talked a little bit about the interrelation of knowledge and action, and I have another example of that coming up. But also the interrelation of self and surroundings. Now, I want to stress that the environmental, social, and political categories or framework that I've used isn't designed to segregate these fields, but to collapse at some point and show their kind of fundamental utility. Natural astrological practice was, in most cases, a generalized form of speculative and predictive activity, so weather forecasting or even predicting plants to do well when planted at particular times, are not so far removed from the expressly political character of judicial divinatory astrology with its projections and debates. It might look very similar on the ground, and moreover there was theoretical backing. It was all within the continuum of investigating nature and the unfolding of history. Politics was something that humans were thought to just do, naturally. If I can borrow Alan Watts's expression about how just as an apple tree apples, to turn that into a verb, so the earth peoples naturally. Likewise, decoding information about one's fate using horary techniques was simply to utilize all the available evidence in drawing together conclusions and making decisions, and can't so easily be distinguished from natural philosophical endeavors to investigate the book of nature. And we have, the Enlightenment to thank for that kind of distinction very often, but it's one that historians of astrology and of magic are kind of coming around to taking apart, and rightly so. The rhizomatic root, if you forgive the pun, of the issue is that divination is rational. Now, as Patrick Curry puts it, and this is one of my favorite quotes of his, logic of whatever kind contains no guarantees as to the correctness of its premises. And you can start with these occult principles of reflection, contagion, and sympathy, never mind occult virtue or the existence of spirits, as your axioms, and then from there be entirely reasonable and rational and still doing divination. There might be more in discussing how practitioners felt about their practices, and perhaps in distinguishing between those who cast horoscopes and those who cast sigils and other astral talismans. I'm not suggesting that all astrologers were also definitely wizards, but I'm also definitely suggesting that most wizards were also astrologers, and that many astrologers were engaged in things that blurred distinctions. There's one concrete example of this, of the merchant and diarist Samuel Jeek, who was who cast many elections for good journeys. One for proposing to the future Mrs. Jeek, which would be quite pleased to know was successful. But I want to concentrate on one of these. It's an election that he elected a time for the building of a new storehouse. And the historians Michael Hunter and Annabel Gregory have observed that he even had this figure let into the wall of the building, and they say like a kind of talisman. And the truly talismanic nature of such an engraving should be considered in the context of image magic and the principle of sympathy. As astrological glyphs were thought to attract the power of the thing they represented, see the various astrological sigils that were used for a variety of purposes, an election figure adorning the project for which it was cast becomes as much a magnet for the forces it depicts as merely a research exercise, or market research. Elections thereby demonstrate the interlinked nature, in this case anyway, of astrological knowledge and action applications again, and also highlight how astrology's rationality cannot be clearly cut away from its magic. Just as knowledge and action are demonstrably fused in knowing when best to act, so too are astrology and magic, in many cases here, a codependent admixture of symbol and utility. In election, the casting of a figure becomes more than simply measuring or even interpretation. It becomes a ritual in which certain times for action become sacralized, emphasized as they are, underlined with astrological significance. And this is not something that escaped Jeek, who frequently in the front half of his diary denied making elections or anything even resembling that kind of stuff, whereas in the back, again enciphered, conducted many of these things. Sigils and other charms thought to preserve the favorable planetary influences and to place them permanently at the disposal of the wearer are especially important to a central argument that, as Cap puts it, magic here was clearly fused with astrology. And I'd like to affirm this statement, but to take from it a slightly different interpretation. I would argue that instead of seeing sigils as merely one form of astrological activity that fused with magic, as opposed to other more scientific forms of astrology, and again there are heavy scare quotes around scientific there, sigils mark a point on an interdisciplinary astrological magical spectrum at which it becomes most clear to modern thinkers that astrology itself was fused with magic, at least in this period. And so it is we come to discussing, finally, knowledge and action. Astrological interrelation meant all things transmitted an effect as well as receiving one. A diseased mind, and in particular a diseased imagination, not only absorbed but transmitted an influence that would affect changing humours and exert a negative influence on the bodies and minds of people around them. What might nowadays be explained as powers of suggestion was understood as effects of an underlying link between knowledge and the physical body. The physician John Cotter, a staunch critic of astrology, popularized the case of two female patients who, following being misdiagnosed, promptly developed the very diseases that they had been told that they had already contracted. Richard Napier noted the case of Joan Neighbour, who became melancholic after merely hearing about a suicide. And this shouldn't be so surprising, but it's the kind of worldview model of this kind of stuff that I'm fascinated by. Knowledge itself could cause mental and physical ailments by interacting with an individual's consciousness. And again, here we see this this mind-body-soul complex of the early modern sense of self. Thus, early modern psychology writer Robert Burton, who's the author of Anatomy of Melancholy, describes the imagination as the medium deferens of the passions through which themselves, acting upon one's character, one's humours are disposed. Astrology was an essential tool in discerning the influences that an unwary person's imagination could catch and be manipulated by. Moreover, it could prescribe treatments for these plagued victims. Knowledge itself was an active participant in this astrological story of fate. By understanding astrological, magical sympathies and antipathies, the underlying natures and operations of celestial forces, diagnosis, and especially prognosis was a kind of treatment. By knowing the astrological identity of the problem, one could automatically relate it to its relevant antidotes and prescribe a way to manipulate the dilemma. It is for these reasons that astrology, though beginning as a system of explanation, quote, thus ended as one that held out the prospect of control. And this is a thing that interests me very much, the manipulation of what we might call the ontological taxons of divination for operative sorcery. In summary then, early modern astrology provides us with a rich social and cultural focus for studying the fusing of magic and astrology, the fusing of knowledge and action, and the fusing of humans and their environment. As we've seen, astrology was based upon fundamentally magical premises at this time and functioned in a variety of other magical practices. Study of astrology provided myriad examples of the illuminating, inspiring, and affecting nature of both illicit and orthodox forms of knowledge. It also presented early modern comprehension of knowledge itself as performative and magical, as well as showing how methods and models of understanding reflect or even mimic the subjects being explored, which is again a fascinating example of similitude, sympathy, and signature. Astrology demonstrates how human understanding situates itself in relation to what it considers by exploring a universal and interrelating ontology of experience. I have tried to show not only how astrology presumes the interrelationship between individuals, nature, and the cosmos, but how the art itself, reflecting that set of relationships, is conceived by its practitioners and audience as a dynamic, interrelated set of functions, interpretive devices, and affective rituals. 17th century English astrology functioned as an early modern grand unified theory, as an interpretive and intercessory system for understanding and acting in a magical universe by constructing correspondences in what was conceived of precise functional significance for all phenomena. And so I dedicate this talk today to the stars and to the early modern dead who followed them. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, one comment is, how about a few more hours?
Indeed, indeed. That would be lovely. We discussed briefly in it that my background is as one might have told in things like the study of grimoires, magical texts, and things generally labelled the esoteric. And I'd be delighted to talk more about early modern interrelations of magic and astrology.
I think, well, you've got claps excitedly, so yes, I think that sounds good. Question here, related to the political implications of astrology, how do you see resurrection of this knowledge and practice as a political act?
Oh my word. Well, I think we're still seeing it, aren't we? There's a tendency when I'm talking about history to refer to astrology in the past tense, and I really don't mean to suggest that I'm not aware that people are doing it now and finding useful things. That what was noted recently, something along the lines of a particular eclipse occurring in a significant part of Bernie Sanders' nativity. I think it's certainly still being used, and it obviously. As to resurrecting particular techniques, I would suggest, and again this is my magical bias coming in, there are plenty of astrological images for both getting ahead in politics, in receiving honours, and prelates, which is the slightly clerical term for gaining the love of lords, is very popular, and of ladies. But also of specific, there's a specific Libran sigil, of course it's Libra, for bolstering the support of the oppressed against the powerful and tyrannous. I would recommend that it can't hurt to try and cast some of these things.
Well, I'd say the political side of astrology is totally alive and well in this election season here in the United States.
Mm. But again, it provides that totalizing, and I mean that in a good way, context. We can understand proclamations of politics as having this this effect on all, sometimes called not spheres but planes of existence. Michael McDonald likes talking about planes of existence in terms of different areas of life and different ways that we interrelate to each other.
Here's another question. You discussed occult virtues frequently. Could you discuss these virtues or spirit a little bit more?
Yeah. Well, we can start by thinking about a scaffolding of what we might mean by magic. I want to call it a delineation or a description rather than a definition of magic, because it's squirrely, as many philosophers of mind and also of religion and theology have really struggled to define it. I just want to describe early modern magic as what seems to be the activity of attempting to understand and change the world, utilizing certain occult principles relating to the organization and the operation of the cosmos. So that organization is, expressly what I think referred to as ontological taxonomy. It's the four elements that make the building block of life, the 7 planets and their heptarchic rulership of all things, in the sublunary worlds. It's the 12 zodiacal signs. It's also the decans, the mansions, all that kind of thing. The principles of organization are arguably the what, the how is really down to this what I'm calling these occult principles of operation. These are things like reflection, as above, so below, the similitude, sympathy, signature, which are all subtly different. But crucially, what's going on, like I want to say, kind of behind them, is this notion of occult virtue. Now, there are several layers of this. One of them is the non-manifest qualities. Now, the manifest qualities, as we talked about, were these hot, cold, dry, and wet. And as I've said, that they allow the combination of elements, but also their fixity. The non-manifest qualities, for those qualities that Aristotelian scholasticism saw but couldn't explain using the manifest ones. Poisoning is a really good example, and even the mixture of a certain substance into another substance. The famous experiment of putting 1 drop of black ink into milk, and at what point is it no longer white? This blurring of distinctions again. So occult virtue, in essence, can be thought of as what is informing why any of this is happening in the first place. And it gets, occasionally very mystical. There are plenty of people that want to talk about, this being the grace of God, that certain things are imbued, and there's certainly an awful lot of Christian astrological magic that's employing this. It is said that the planets themselves, by Trithemius, who not only teaches Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa, but is also frequently quoted by William Lilly. It is said that the planetary archangels, or even the planets themselves, or their intelligences, and it's kind of vague around this, or variegated, be a more accurate term, that these are the secondary intelligences before the throne of God. And so there is this idea that they are the as I said, the kind of mediating forces of this emanation of God's grace into the world, the way in which things are said to affect other things and be affected by them. And this, as I said, comes back to certain Aristotelian metaphysic around form and matter and around activity and passivity. And it's also a pun that thankfully works in Greek as well as English, where we talk about not just activity but actualization, that you know, the acorn knows to be a tree through its form as well as its matter. And it's here that we see, you know, analytical philosophers nowadays like to talk about how it is difficult for us to talk about the properties of matter because it implies that it's something that they own, that this is a difficult, or it's not difficult, but it's not a useful way of thinking about matter and its relation and its affectivities. And so I think in Occult Virtue we actually have one of those babies that's thrown out with the bathwater in the Enlightenment, where virtue is you know, can be thought of and seen in the text as this interrelating process model of how things relate to other things, and how in a you know, naturally magical, organic, intelligent cosmos, things are speaking to each other. And it's there that we get the, I don't want to call it anthropomorphizing because it implies that, you know, animism isn't a valid view, but that's where we start finding faces on natural forces, and where we start dealing with the agency of non-material human intelligences, whether that's, you know, the Christian views of Michael fighting Satan or Belial and the older models, or whether we're talking, you know, the utility of elementals like salamanders, which are also, you know, popularly consulted with by astrologers and astrological magicians. But it also includes a variety of other kind of what I would call very relatively animistic models of how things work. And so it's this idea of virtue as not energy, although that can be, again, a useful scaffolding to consider it, but of the indwelling propensities to act and affect and be affected by things. I hope that's some kind of explanation towards Occult Virtue, that's useful for people. I would recommend everyone read more Agrippa, but that's my standard response. I say that about everything.
Well, we'll have to see if Eric goes into that in his lecture on Agrippa. It'll be interesting. Well, we are past our time, so thank you, everyone, and thank you, Al. This was wonderful.
Thank you very much for having me, and thank you, everyone, for attending.